It's an interesting time for Indigenous business in this country. We've seen some incredible advancements in the way that the government and private sectors have prioritized procurement or buying from First Nations. But are they doing it the right way? We were first warned of how Indigenous procurement could be exploited. An excerpt from the Ottawa Citizen story, mere months before the policy launched, wrote about a real danger that non-Aboriginal businessmen would set up shell companies with an Aboriginal address and partners to scoop up easy contracts and tax benefits. I'm going to go over a few main points. Firstly, the idea of what a rent-a-feather is and how it's being flagged at the federal contract level through the ArriveCan app scandal with Dalian Enterprise. I'm also going to talk about respected First Nation business leader David Acko, who's experienced the federal land procurement landscape firsthand, and a local contract arrangement with Joe Ladisser and Steve Ward Contracting. Hang tight, it's going to be a ride, and I will provide all links in the story. Let's start with the definition of a rent-a-feather. A rent-a-feather is a term used by Indigenous business community to describe tokenistic arrangements with third parties to advance success of the third party with minimal benefit to the Indigenous partner. Alternatively, joint ventures with communities or nations are a reasonable and acceptable approach as the benefit accrues to the entire nation. What's incredibly troubling with the scenario with an individual joint venture rent-a-feather company is only one individual benefits at the cost of the nation. More on Joe Ladisser in a bit. It's been out for about a year now since the story busted wide open, a story on Global News entitled, "This is Fraud. Indigenous Leaders Sound Off on Federal Procurement Program." This is a story of the formation of rent-a-feather company corporations entering into the federal contracting system, which is designed to benefit Indigenous people. Unfortunately, often this is not the case. There is a quote from the article that is incredibly alarming. It goes as such: "This is fraud, this is criminal behavior, and companies misrepresenting themselves should be barred from doing any business with the government going forward." In the next article, beneath ArriveCan in the Globe and Mail, the investigation digs deeper into Dalian Enterprises, a First Nation company who is in partnership with Corodex Technology Consulting, a larger non-Indigenous company. Both have since been suspended. Since 2003, though, the combined companies have collected and been paid up to $635 million. Dalian received $139 million of that amount. Dalian has just 2 full-time employees. The warnings continued, and most recently, according to the Globe and Mail, on March 14th, there was a great expose on the shady dealings within federal procurement systems and companies. It was entitled, "Ottawa was warned about problems with Indigenous procurement, but grew." David Acko, a longtime First Nation business leader, has been, he's seen the inside of the guts of what's going on. He's been approached many times by non-Indigenous businesses to team up for and bid on contracts, which he acknowledges that his company would get a cut without having to do any of the work, often 5% of the contract. But because of his values and scruples, David has never accepted one of these arrangements as they are morally and ethically wrong. So what's the connection to what's happening in our region to our First Nation communities? And specifically, the rent-a-feather company Joe Ladisser is a partner with. Enter Hydro One. They've made some great strides as of late with First Nations in Ontario. For instance, 133 First Nations, including our own community, Sandpoint, have become 2.5% shareholder owners of Hydro One. Fantastic. Any kind of development that goes forward, there is an opportunity for First Nations to own 50% of those opportunities. Fantastic. And lastly, Hydro One is prioritizing contracting opportunities with our nations and businesses. All good news, right? Well, mostly. The Indigenous procurement program can be and is unfortunately being manipulated. I went to Hydro One's procurement directory and found a company that was rumored to be owned in some way by Joe Ladisser, Otakimi Contracting Limited Partner. There I found a company with the main contact being Kyle McAdam, with an address of 10B Copper Thunderbird Road on Sandpoint First Nation, just down the street from where I live. I inquired at our community office to see if there was a registered band member named Kyle McAdam. No was the response. The house was previously occupied by a matriarch of our community who was dearly missed, and her husband. The home has been vacant now for about a half a year. So I did a bit more digging and found Otakimi on a Dun and Bradstreet report, which will be provided. But it had a different address. Its location is in Thunder Bay. I then discovered one of the principal owners is Steve Ward, plus one other listed on the page. Unfortunately, contact number 2 is under a lock and key and cannot easily be discovered by simply clicking on the link. So I did a bit more digging, and I called Dun and Bradstreet and was able to obtain a 12-page report on the company Otakimi. Now, the company was started 3 years ago with the name principal Steve Ward in the line of business of contracting. So let me pause here for a second. Who is Steve Ward, and why does he have an address on Sandpoint First Nation in addition to Thunder Bay? Steve has conducted business with our First Nation during the tenure of Joe Lattiser, the previous chief. The contract was for road construction, ditching, and some landscaping. Here is the homepage of his very successful company. So why did Steve Ward establish another duplicate company, Otakimi, with an anonymous partner? More on that shortly. I kept reading, and on page 6 of the Duns and Bradstreet report, the maximum credit recommendation for Otakimi is $16,000 Canadian. This makes no sense. How does a successful multi-million-dollar company like Steve Ward's only have access to $16,000 in credit? Look at all the equipment that he has on his website. It brought me back to the Globe and Mail article. In some cases, joint venture creation, a non-Aboriginal firm, Steve Ward, will enlist an Aboriginal figurehead, Joe Lattiser, to act as the front for the venture, but there is no real Aboriginal content. In some cases, it was noted Aboriginal shell corporations have been created to take advantage of set-asides, or in this case, an honorable procurement program like Hydro One. Remember David Atco's reflections? He's been approached many times by non-Indigenous businesses to team up for a bid on a contract while he himself acknowledges that his company would get a cut without having to do any work. Again, David is a principled First Nation business leader and never entered into any of these dishonest deals. So who is Steve Ward, listed principal partner? Well, on page 11 of the Duns and Bradstreet report, we finally come to that answer. As you can see on the bottom of the page, both Steve Ward and Joe Lattiser are partners in a rent-a-feather scheme. How can we be so sure this is a rent-a-feather arrangement? One only needs to ask themselves, why would Steve Ward set up a company to bring on an individual that has no real capital? Joe retired from the city, a respectable career, but certainly not one that can back millions of dollars in collateral, nor does he have any significant business background. Remember page 6 of the Duns report that stated only $16,000 in maximum credit recommendation? And most importantly, the partnership would have to show Joe Lattiser, at least on paper, as being the majority shareholder to gain access to the Hydro One projects, a rent-a-feather. What is the impact on our community? What is the impact on you, the community of members of Sandpoint? Sandpoint, our First Nation, has a 3-way partnership with Rocky Bay First Nation and Red Rock First Nation in a development corporation named 3 Nations Resource Limited. This corporation is nation-owned and designed to benefit the communities and their citizens through jobs, training, and revenue. Another community-owned and operated venture in the region, Minotaman Development LP, is owned by Nunavut, Aroland, and Gunungaming First Nations to maximize First Nation participation in development projects. Their vision statement goes on to state, the goal is to ensure that the benefits from the development projects in our regions are shared equitably with our First Nations to grow our local economy and provide opportunities for our members. First Nation development corporations are a common and accepted practice across the country. Our First Nations have been largely unsuccessful to date in securing any contracts from Hydro One. Minotaman has not been able to secure any high-value construction opportunities from Hydro One either. According to the Hydro One Indigenous procurement brochure, They are committed to purchasing 5% of their total spend with Indigenous companies. The question is, where is the First Nation spend going in our region, if not to our First Nations? Otakimi. Otakimi Contracting Limited has been designed as a rent-a-feather to benefit one community member, Joe Lattiser, and a non-Indigenous existing contractor, Steve Ward, to gain access to contracts that are meant for our First Nation communities. The question of how many millions of dollars has been awarded to Otakimi will surface, and there are investigation instruments to be used to prod both Hydro One and Joe's company, Otakimi. The other question Sandpoint community members need to be asking themselves, is this the leader you want as your chief who sets up questionable rent-a-feather businesses designed to benefit himself? He sits at home and collects a paycheck to the detriment of our First Nations. He doesn't have the courage to list himself as a partner on any of the websites or as a contact. I've spent a better part of my career working with and supporting Indigenous businesses across Canada and the world. I've worked with incredible leaders in this country, and none of them have displayed the secrecy nor the self-centered, soul-benefiting qualities that Joe Lattiser has shown. I, for one, am incredibly disappointed to have had to research this issue. Choose wisely.